It was one of those mornings at Kensington Palace where everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. The sky was a flat, pale grey, the kind that settles over London like a heavy blanket in early autumn, not threatening rain but not promising sun either. The gardens were trimmed to perfection, the gravel paths freshly raked, and the tall iron gates stood in their usual dignified silence. From the outside, it looked like a postcard. From the inside, it was a carefully choreographed machine where every single moving part had a name, a role, and a reason for being exactly where it was. Prince George was 9 years old that morning. He had the kind of energy that could fill a room without making any noise, the sort of restless, bright-eyed alertness that belongs entirely to children who are curious about everything and bored by nothing. He had woken up earlier than usual, which was not uncommon. He was already dressed, already had breakfast, and was already beginning to drift through the corridors of the palace the way he sometimes did when the day felt long before it had even properly started. The palace staff knew his rhythms well. They had learned them the way experienced sailors learn the patterns of the sea. They knew when he was in a chatty mood and when he wanted to be left alone. They knew which snacks he liked and which ones he would politely decline. They knew his routines, his habits, and the small, unremarkable things that made up the private texture of a royal child's ordinary day. That morning, there was a small gathering scheduled in one of the interior reception rooms. Not a formal event, nothing ceremonial or photographed. It was a quiet meeting, the kind that happens constantly in royal households without ever making the news. A few representatives from a charitable organization had been invited to present a project they had been developing for over a year, something related to conservation and youth education. Princess Catherine had agreed to receive them personally, and the atmosphere inside the palace that morning was calm, purposeful, and entirely routine. George had no formal role in the gathering. He was a child. His presence that morning was simply the presence of a boy who lived there, who wandered in and out of rooms the way children do in their own homes, even if that home happened to have 47 rooms and a security detail station at every entrance. The reception room had been prepared with care. A long table held an arrangement of refreshments, the standard offering for such occasions. There were small sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, a selection of biscuits, a bowl of fruit, and, at the center of the table, a row of tall glass pitchers filled with water and what appeared to be various infused drinks. Cucumber water, something with a faint tinge of elderflower, and one that had a slightly darker, more amber hue. Nobody thought twice about the drinks. They had been prepared by kitchen staff, the same staff who prepared everything that went into the palace. The protocol for food and drink preparation in royal residences was not casual. There were checks, there were approvals, there were people whose entire job was to make sure that nothing harmful ever made it past the kitchen door. It was a system that had been refined over decades, maybe longer, and it worked because everyone trusted it. George wandered into the corridor outside the reception room sometime in the mid-morning. He wasn't supposed to be there in any official sense, but he wasn't forbidden from being there either. It was his home. He was doing what children do in their homes. He moved through the hallway with his hands shoved into the pockets of his trousers, glancing at the paintings on the wall with the mild, unfocused interest of someone who has walked past them 500 times. The door to the reception room was slightly ajar. He could hear voices inside, low and grown-up and full of the particular rhythms that adults use when they are discussing something important in polite company. He wasn't interested in the conversation. He was interested, in the way that children often are, in the food. He pushed the door open a little further and slipped inside. The representatives were gathered at one end of the room, deep in conversation with two members of the household staff who were facilitating the meeting. Nobody noticed George immediately. He moved with the casual confidence of a child in familiar territory, drifting toward the refreshment table the way a compass needle drifts toward north. He looked at the biscuits. He considered the sandwiches. Then, his eyes settled on the pitchers of drinks lined up in a neat row, and he reached for a glass. He had almost lifted the amber-colored drink to his lips. Almost. The movement happened so fast that several people in the room did not even register it as a deliberate action at first. One of the royal protection officers, a man who had been stationed near the door with the practiced stillness of someone who has learned to look invisible, crossed the room in 3 steps that somehow made almost no sound at all. His hand came down gently but, with absolute certainty on the glass in George's hand, redirecting it back to the table before it reached the boy's mouth. George blinked. The officer said something quiet, something low, something that only George could hear. His voice was calm. His face gave away nothing. But, his eyes told a different story, the kind of story that trained professionals learn to read in fractions of seconds. The room had not stopped. The conversation at the other end continued. The charitable representatives were still talking about conservation zones and youth outreach programs. The household staff were still nodding and making notes. On the surface, nothing had happened. But something had happened. It had happened in the space of 2 seconds, in a movement so controlled and so practiced that it looked almost like nothing at all. The officer had reached across the invisible line that separates a normal morning from a catastrophic one, and he had pulled a child back from it without anyone in the room knowing that was what he had just done. George looked at the glass on the table. Then, he looked up at the officer. Then, he reached for a biscuit instead and wandered back toward the door. The officer returned to his position near the entrance. He did not speak to anyone. He did not make a phone call. Not yet. But, behind the stillness of his expression, something had already been set in motion, a quiet, urgent chain of professional judgment that would unfold over the next several hours in ways that nobody outside a very small group of people would ever fully know about. The amber drink sat on the table. Nobody else reached for it. The gathering continued for another 40 minutes. People shook hands, expressed enthusiasm for the project, and said their warm farewells in the precise and practiced way of those who move through formal spaces regularly. The representatives were escorted out. The room was cleared. The refreshment table was tidied. But, before the pictures were removed, the officer had made a quiet request. Not dramatic. Not alarming. Just a request, delivered in the tone of someone performing a routine task, that the contents of the amber pitcher be set aside and not discarded. He had noticed something. It was not a smell, exactly. It was not a color that was obviously wrong. It was something subtler, something in the quality of the liquid itself, the way it settled, the way the light moved through it differently from the way it moved through the other pitchers. It was the kind of thing that most people would never notice, the kind of detail that only registers when you have spent years training yourself to notice exactly that kind of detail. He could have been wrong. He knew that. He had been wrong before about smaller things. But, the protocol in these situations was not to wait until you were certain. The protocol was to treat the uncertainty itself as the signal. So he set the pitcher aside. And, he made a call. The palace that afternoon looked, from every external angle, exactly as it always looked. The guards stood at their posts. The flag flew in its proper position. The gravel paths were still neatly raked. Tourists on the other side of the gate took photographs. A few pigeons crossed the sky in the particular aimless way of London pigeons, as if they had somewhere to be but had forgotten where. Inside, in a room that had nothing to do with any of this, 3 people were having a conversation that the rest of the world would never hear. George was upstairs. He was doing homework, or something that looked like homework, at a desk in his private study room. He had already moved on from the morning. He was 9 years old. He had reached for a drink, a grown-up had redirected his hand, and the moment had lasted 2 seconds and meant nothing to him. He did not know that the officer had made a call. He did not know about the pitcher. He did not know that the word contamination had been used, quietly and carefully, in a room on the other side of the palace. He did not know any of it. He was just a boy doing his homework on an ordinary Wednesday, in a house that happened to have 47 rooms, wondering if there would be time to go outside before dinner. The amber pitcher sat in a separate room, sealed, waiting. And, the day, which had looked so entirely routine from every possible angle, had already become something else entirely. It had become the kind of day that gets written into reports, discussed in debriefs, and never spoken about outside those rooms. The kind of day that most people would call a near miss, except that the whole point of what the officer had done was to make sure that it never got close enough to be called that. It had been close enough. It had been a glass lifted halfway. It had been 2 seconds and 3 steps and 1 quiet word. And, somewhere in the background of the palace's ordinary afternoon, the machine that existed specifically to prevent extraordinary things from happening was already running at full speed, silent and invisible, the way it always did. The way it was built to do. The way it had to do, every single day, for a family that could never fully know how many mornings like this one had already passed without incident, and how much work went into keeping it that way. The laboratory technician who received the sealed pitcher that afternoon was not told whose home it had come from. That was intentional. The chain of custody protocols used by the Royal Protection Services had been designed with exactly that kind of deliberate omission in mind. The fewer people who knew the full picture at any given moment, the less likely that information was to spread in ways that couldn't be controlled. So the technician received a sealed container, a reference number, and an instruction to prioritize the analysis. She did not receive a story. She did not receive a name. She received a job, and she did it. The officer who had made the call sat in a small office on the other side of London and waited. He was not a man who fidgeted. He had spent years removing fidgeting from his body the same way you might remove a splinter, carefully, deliberately, until it was gone. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and stared at a middle distance that didn't contain anything in particular and thought through what he had seen that morning with the precise, methodical attention of someone reviewing footage frame by frame. He went back over it in his mind. The table had been prepared by the kitchen staff. He had been in the room when the refreshments were brought in, which was standard. He had not noticed anything unusual at that point. The pictures had looked correct, smelled correct, appeared correct in every way that his training told him to assess. He had catalogued them the way he catalogued everything in a room he was responsible for and moved on. The charitable representatives had arrived. They were a known group, vetted months in advance, the kind of background-checked, credentialed, thoroughly investigated organization that made it through the layers of royal household screening without flags. There was nothing in their file to suggest a threat. There had been nothing in his read of them that morning to suggest one either. They were exactly what they appeared to be, which was a group of earnest, well-meaning people who cared very much about conservation zones. George had slipped into the room maybe 20 minutes after the gathering began. And the officer had watched him drift toward the table the way he always watched everything in a room he was responsible for, with the same calm, comprehensive attention. He had seen the boy's hand reach for the glass. He had seen which picture it was drawn from. And, in the fraction of a second that it takes for a trained mind to assemble the details it has been passively collecting all morning, something had landed. He couldn't have explained it easily to someone who hadn't done the work. It was not a single thing. It was a texture of several small things stacked on top of each other. The way the sediment in the amber pitcher had settled slightly differently from the way it had settled an hour earlier, the way the surface of the liquid had a quality to it that he couldn't name precisely but that his eyes had filed under wrong, the fact that no one at the gathering had poured from that particular pitcher yet, even though all the others had been used. None of those things, on their own, would have been enough. All of them together, in the space of the half-second before a 9-year-old boy put a glass to his lips, had been more than enough. He had moved. And now he was sitting in a small office waiting for a phone call, doing the thing that his training had prepared him for and that no training can fully prepare you for, which was sitting with the possibility that he might have just caught something very serious, or might have just overreacted to cucumber water and the afternoon light playing tricks on a glass pitcher. Both were possible. He sat with both. The phone call came at 5:15. The technician's report was delivered through a third party, which was also protocol. The language in the report was precise and clinical, the kind of language that strips the drama out of something in order to communicate it accurately, but the content, once you translated it out of the measured vocabulary of laboratory analysis, was not clinical at all. The amber pitcher had contained a substance that should not have been there. It was not the most dangerous thing imaginable. It was not something that would have killed a healthy adult. But it was not nothing. It was a chemical compound, a specific one, the kind of thing that does not end up in a drink by accident and does not occur naturally in any combination of elderflower and fruit infusion. It was the kind of thing that someone puts somewhere. The kind of thing that requires knowledge and access and intent. In an adult, the effects would have been unpleasant but manageable.
Disorientation. Nausea.
A period of confusion significant enough to be frightening but not lasting enough to cause permanent harm. In a child of 9, weighing roughly 30 kilograms, the dosage that would have been consumed in a single glass would have been disproportionate in ways that the report outlined in careful, measured language that nonetheless made the officer's jaw tighten when he read it. He read the report twice. Then, he made 3 calls. The first call was to his direct superior.
The second was to the palace's head of household security.
The third was to a contact in a department whose name he did not use on open lines.
Each call was short.
Each conveyed the essential information. Each ended with an instruction to him to remain available and to document everything he had observed that morning in writing before the end of the evening.
He pulled out a notepad. He did not use a computer for this.
He wrote by hand, in the small, neat print of someone who was taught to write for clarity rather than speed, and he recorded everything from the moment he entered the reception room that morning to the moment he set the picture aside.
He included times. He included positions.
He included the exact sequence of observations that had led to the decision to intervene.
He did not include the word lucky.
He did not think in those terms. Lucky was what happened when you weren't paying attention and things worked out anyway.
What had happened that morning was something different.
What had happened that morning was what was supposed to happen, what the entire structure of royal protection was built to make happen, the system working correctly, doing what it was designed to do. He finished the document, signed it, and set it face down on the desk.
On the other side of London, in the palace, the evening was unfolding with complete normality. Dinner had happened. Baths had happened.
The gradual, gentle winding down of a household with children had happened in the way it always did, with the particular combination of chaos and routine that belongs to families everywhere, regardless of how many rooms their house contains. George had eaten something with pasta in it and declared it acceptable. He had lost a brief argument about screen time and accepted the outcome with the resigned dignity of someone who knows they're going to bring it up again tomorrow. He had been read to, or had read himself, and was now in that drowsy, half-present state that precedes sleep in children, where the body is already shutting down but the mind is still producing a slow, ambient trickle of half-formed thoughts.
He did not know about the report.
He did not know about the 3 phone calls. He did not know about the documents sitting face down on a desk in a small office across the city. He knew that a man had stopped him from drinking something and that he had eaten a biscuit instead and that the rest of the day had been completely ordinary. He probably already had the vague, beginning to blur quality of a morning event that a child's brain is in the process of moving into the category of things that happened but don't need to be stored carefully.
He was almost asleep.
The investigation that had been set in motion that afternoon was not the kind of investigation that makes news.
It was not the kind with press conferences or official statements.
It operated in the quiet space beneath public awareness, where things are examined and tracked and understood without being spoken about in rooms that contain more than 4 people. The questions being asked were specific and methodical. Where had the picture come from? Who had prepared it? At what point in the morning had its contents been altered, and by whom, and how, and what exactly did that person think was going to happen?
Those questions were going to take time.
The one thing that was not in question, the one fact that sat at the center of everything like a fixed point that everything else had to orient itself around, was the fact that it had not happened. Whatever had been intended, whatever sequence of events someone had set in motion when they introduced a foreign compound into an amber pitcher of elderflower water on a table in a palace reception room, it had not reached its conclusion.
It had been stopped. Not by a dramatic intervention.
Not by an alarm or a crisis or a moment that anyone in that room would have described as frightening. It had been stopped by a man crossing a room in 3 quiet steps and placing his hand on a glass. That was the whole story, in one sense.
In another sense, that was only the beginning of it.
Because investigations of this kind do not end when the immediate danger is neutralized.
They begin there.
The picture had been analyzed. The compound had been identified. The chain of custody for the refreshments had been traced back through the morning's preparation timeline. And, at a certain point in that timeline, there was a gap.
Not a large one. Not an obvious one.
The kind of gap that would have been invisible to almost anyone looking at the morning's record. But it was there. And, in the quiet, meticulous world of royal security, a gap in a timeline is not a small thing.
A gap in a timeline is a door. And a door means someone went through it.
And that means someone knew which door to use.
The implications of that were not comfortable. They were not supposed to be comfortable.
The officer sat with those implications the way he had sat with the uncertainty that afternoon, flatly, steadily, without flinching from them and, without rushing to resolve them before they were ready to be resolved. He had done his job. He had done it correctly. The boy was asleep in his bed on the other side of the city, and nothing had happened, and that was what mattered most. Everything else was the work that came after. And there was a great deal of it. The people who had been brought into the small circle of knowledge that evening were not people who alarmed easily. They were professionals who had spent careers in proximity to risk, who had learned to assess danger with the same flat-eyed practicality that a structural engineer applies to a cracked foundation. You identify it. You measure it. You do not panic. You fix it. But, even among people who do not alarm easily, there was a quality to the conversations that happened that evening that was different from the routine debriefs and the standard post-event reviews. It was quieter. More careful. The kind of careful that comes not from fear but from the full understanding of how close something had come, and what the distance between close and not close is worth. A glass lifted halfway. A man crossing a room. 3 steps. One hand on glass. That was the margin. That was the whole, entire margin between an ordinary Wednesday and something that would have been, in every possible way, the opposite of ordinary. The picture had been disposed of safely. The documentation was filed. The investigation was underway. The palace was quiet. The flag was flying. The gravel paths were still perfectly raked. And a 9-year-old boy was asleep in his bed, dreaming of whatever 9-year-old boys dream about, entirely unaware that the day had contained anything other than homework and pasta and a small argument about screen time. Which was exactly how it was supposed to be. That was the point of all of it, the whole intricate, invisible, endlessly rehearsed machinery of protection and protocol and practiced attention. The point was that the child in the bed would never know. The point was the ordinariness of his evening. The point was that the danger existed and was stopped and left no trace in him at all. That was the whole point. And, somewhere across the city, in a small office with a face-down document on the desk, the man who had made it so sat and let himself be, just for a moment, exactly as tired as he was of the investigation moved the way serious investigations always move, which is to say it moved slowly in the places where speed would have been satisfying, and, with uncomfortable speed in the places where you would have preferred it to take its time. The team assigned to trace the chain of events from the preparation of the refreshments to the moment the pitcher was set aside worked backwards through the morning in the way archaeologists work through a dig site, carefully, layer by layer, treating each detail as potentially significant and each gap as potentially the most significant thing of all. They had a timeline. The kitchen staff had been interviewed, individually, with the kind of measured thoroughness that makes people feel like they are simply recounting a morning routine and only later understand they were being assessed as carefully as anything else in the room. The preparation of the refreshments had begun at 8:30. 3 members of the kitchen team had been involved. The pitchers had been filled, covered with cloth, and placed on a trolley for transport to the reception room. The transport had taken approximately 12 minutes. During those 12 minutes, the trolley had passed through 4 interior corridors. The gap was in the second corridor. It was not a dramatic gap. It was not an unlocked door swinging open or a figure disappearing around a corner. It was 2 minutes and 40 seconds during which the trolley had been stationary, unattended, in a section of corridor that was less traffic than the others. The member of staff who had been transporting it had stepped briefly into an adjacent room to retrieve a forgotten item, a detail so ordinary, so perfectly unremarkable, that it would have registered as nothing in any other context. In this context, 2 minutes and 40 seconds was a very long time. The corridor had 1 camera. The camera's angle covered approximately 70% of the corridor's length. The trolley had been positioned in the remaining 30%. The people reviewing the footage stared at that 30% of blank corridor wall for a long time. There was nothing to see. That was the problem. The absence of footage was not evidence of anything on its own. People who introduce things into drinks do not do so in front of cameras, which meant that the absence of footage in that particular section of corridor was either meaningless or the most meaningful thing in the entire timeline, and the only way to know which was to keep pulling the thread. They pulled it in every direction. They looked at access logs for that section of the palace in the 2 hours preceding the incident. They looked at the staff rota. They looked at the visitor log for the charitable organization representatives, cross-referencing arrival times, escort routes, and every moment of their presence inside the building against every other piece of information the morning had produced. They looked at deliveries. They looked at contractors. They looked at anyone and anything that had moved through the relevant sections of the palace that morning with a kind of comprehensive, impartial attention that left no category unexamined. It took the better part of 2 days. At the end of those 2 days, the investigators had not found a person holding a syringe. They had not found a confession. What they had found was a pattern of small anomalies, individually ignorable, collectively significant, that pointed to a level of familiarity with the palace's interior layout and daily routines that should not have been possible for anyone outside a very limited circle. Whoever had done this had known about the gathering. Had known what refreshments would be served. Had known the route the trolley would take. Had known which section of that route was outside the camera's angle. Had known the approximate time when the trolley would be unattended. That was a lot of knowing. The implications of that level of operational knowledge sat in the room like something with weight and temperature, something you could feel pressing against the edges of the conversation without anyone having to name it directly. Because the implication was not comfortable and was not something that could be addressed with the kind of straightforward efficiency you could apply to, say, a gap in a camera's coverage. The implication was that the vulnerability was not architectural. It was human. And human vulnerabilities are the hardest ones to close. Meanwhile, life in the palace had continued with the absolute steadiness that the institution demands of itself regardless of what is happening beneath its surface. This is one of the things that the public rarely understands about royal households, the degree to which normalcy is not simply a byproduct of everything going well but is itself an active, continuous effort. The schedule proceeds. The engagements are met. The public appearances happen on time and with the appropriate presentation. Beneath all of that, things can be falling apart in all kinds of ways, and none of it appears in the face that the institution shows the world. George went to school. He came home. He had lessons, arguments about homework, moments of delight over things that delighted him, the full ordinary texture of a child's week. The people around him moved through their responsibilities with the kind of practiced calm that takes years to build and can be maintained even when the thing beneath it is not calm at all. Princess Catherine had been informed. The information was delivered to her with the same precision and care that characterized everything the protection team did, enough detail to convey the seriousness, presented in a way that prioritized her ability to continue functioning without the weight of it stopping her in place. She received it the way people who are accustomed to receiving difficult information receive it, without falling apart in the moment, filing the full weight of it away to process in private, later, when she could afford to. She asked 3 questions. She received 3 answers. She thanked the officer who delivered the briefing and continued with the rest of her afternoon. Later, in the particular quiet that settles over a house after children are in bed, she sat with what she knew. She thought about the morning in the way that parents think about the moments they didn't know were dangerous until after they were over, with the particular, retroactive terror that arrives precisely because it's too late for it to do anything useful. The danger had passed. The system had worked. Her son was asleep upstairs and had no idea any of it had happened. She knew that the system working was the point. She also knew that she would be thinking about that glass for a very long time. The investigation had, by this point, produced enough to act on. Not enough to name a specific individual with the certainty required for formal proceedings, but enough to make specific changes in the systems and structures of the palace's internal operations.
Access to certain corridors was reclassified.
Camera coverage was reviewed and augmented. Protocols for the preparation and transport of refreshments for internal gatherings were revised in ways that added layers without being visibly different from the outside. A review of staff access credentials was initiated across several departments, not in the manner of an accusation but in the manner of an institution performing due diligence on itself. These changes happened quietly, as a matter of course, introduced through the ordinary administrative channels that manage a palace's operations. To anyone watching from outside, nothing had changed.
The same gates. The same guards. The same flag. The same gravel paths.
Inside, everything had been adjusted by exactly the degree that the analysis indicated it needed to be adjusted. This is the part of security work that never appears in any public account, because it is inherently invisible. The measures that succeed leave no visible trace.
You cannot point to an incident that didn't happen. You cannot photograph the version of events that was prevented. The outcome of good security work is the continuation of ordinary days, and ordinary days, by definition, are not interesting to anyone looking for a story. But the people doing the work know. They carry the full knowledge of what the ordinary day was almost not. They move through the spaces they are responsible for with the permanent awareness of the version of events that exists just behind the version that actually happened, the one that was a glass lifted halfway, and they build their systems around the distance between those two versions, and they spend their careers making sure the distance is never closed. The officer had submitted his written account. He had been debriefed twice. He had sat in a formal review session where his actions on the morning of the incident were assessed against the protocols and determined to have been correct in every particular. He received this assessment with the same flatness he had brought to everything else about the incident. He had not done anything heroic. He had done his job. He made no distinction between those two things, because in his view there was no distinction to be made. What he did think about, more than once, during the days that followed, was the specific quality of the 2 seconds before he moved. The moment in which his brain had assembled the accumulated observations of the morning into a single, urgent conclusion while his body was already in motion. He had not made a decision, exactly. There had not been time for the kind of conscious deliberation that the word decision implies. There had been a recognition, and then, a movement, and then, the glass was back on the table and the boy was looking at him with mild, unconcerned curiosity. He thought about that recognition. He had been in this work for 19 years. He had spent those years learning to see, which sounds simple and is the furthest thing from it. You learn to see by accumulating experience in rooms, by spending thousands of hours in a state of divided attention, processing the surface of a room at the same time as its depths, the obvious at the same time as the peripheral, the expected at the same time as the anomalous. You do it long enough and it becomes the way your brain moves through any space it is responsible for, automatically, continuously, without effort or decision. That morning, 19 years of that had condensed into a half second. He thought about what would have happened if he hadn't been in the room. Not because he needed to torture himself with it, but because understanding the proximity of things is part of understanding why the system has to be the way it is, why the redundancies exist, why nothing is ever left to chance if it can be helped. He thought about it the way an engineer thinks about a bridge that held, not with relief alone but with the professional understanding of exactly how much weight it had been carrying and exactly what it would have meant if it hadn't. Then, he filed the thought and went back to work. Because there was always more work. There was always the next room, the next gathering, the next morning that looked routine from every angle and needed to be treated as if it weren't. There was always the next trolley moving through a corridor, the next picture on a table, the next moment in which the accumulated weight of everything that had ever been learned about what people are capable of and what systems are built to prevent had to be deployed without hesitation and without drama. The work did not pause for reflection. It did not acknowledge its own difficulty. It simply continued, the way the institution it protected continued, by presenting a perfectly ordinary face to an ordinary world, and keeping everything that wasn't ordinary somewhere behind that face, handled and contained, out of sight. George came home from school on the 3rd day after the incident and ate a snack in the kitchen and complained that his history lesson had been boring and asked whether there was any possibility of getting a dog, a conversation that had been ongoing for several months with no resolution in sight. He was loud and, completely, entirely himself. The officer's report was already archived. The picture was already gone. The corridor camera's coverage had already been extended. And, the morning that had contained the glass and, the 3 steps and, the quiet word was already moving into the past, settling into the record of things that happened and, were handled and, would not happen again in quite the same way, because the system that had stopped it once had already learned from it and, was already different because of it. That was how it was supposed to work. That was exactly how it worked weeks past. The investigation did not close, but, it moved into the slower, deeper phase of such things, where the urgent questions have been stabilized and, what remains is the harder work of understanding the full shape of what happened. The people responsible for that work were patient by training and, by temperament. They understood that the most significant findings in this kind of inquiry rarely arrive quickly. They arrive in pieces, each piece illuminating a slightly larger portion of the picture, until one day the picture is complete enough to act on in ways that go beyond internal policy adjustments. The chemical compound that had been identified in the picture was traced through its properties to a relatively narrow category of origin. It was not something available over a pharmacy counter. It was not something that a person stumbles across or acquires by accident. The specificity of it, the particular formulation, pointed to sources that the investigators were familiar with in the abstract sense of knowing they exist, even if the connection to this specific incident remained to be established concretely. The forensic chain of analysis was thorough and methodical, and it produced, over time, a picture that was more detailed than the first week had suggested it would be. The pattern of operational knowledge that had troubled the investigators from the beginning, the how did someone know all of this quality of the incident, was examined through every available lens. Interviews continued. Records were reviewed. The kind of slow, patient work that requires people to hold a great deal of information in mind simultaneously and, to be alert to the connections that exist between details separated by time or context or category, the work that looks from the outside like nothing and, is from the inside the most demanding kind of attention. At a certain point in the investigation, a connection emerged that changed the shape of the picture significantly. It was not a dramatic revelation. It was a procedural finding, a thread that led, when followed back carefully, to a pattern of behavior over a period of months that had not been flagged as concerning at the time because none of its individual components had crossed any individual threshold. But, assembled together, in the context of everything that the investigation had established, it formed a coherent and, deeply uncomfortable narrative. The details of that narrative are not, and, were never meant to be, public. The people who handled the situation understood from the outset that its resolution would not be visible. There would be no arrest announced on the evening news. There would be no press statement from the palace. There would be an outcome, reached through channels that operate without publicity, and that outcome would be the last piece of evidence that the system had functioned as intended. What can be said is that the incident was not random. It had not been an opportunistic act by someone with access to the palace who made a spontaneous, impulsive choice on a Tuesday morning. The planning behind it had been deliberate, and the intent behind the planning had been specific in ways that the investigators found deeply clarifying, not because specific intent makes something less disturbing, but because understanding what something was aimed at allows you to assess the broader landscape of threat with much greater precision. Understanding it also clarified, in retrospect, the significance of the particular timing. The gathering that morning had not been widely known about in advance. It had been communicated internally through the household's administrative systems in the way that all such events are communicated, quietly, through the appropriate channels, to the appropriate people. The fact that someone had known about it in time to plan around it, was its own form of information about the source of the vulnerability. The palace administration did not announce the changes it made in response to that information. It made them, and it made them thoroughly, and the outward face of the institution remained exactly as it had always been: the gates, the guards, the flag, the paths, the whole composed, impeccable exterior that the world points cameras at and calls timeless. Inside, the foundation had been reinforced in ways that would never be photographed. The officer had, by this point, returned completely to his regular duties. The incident was filed, archived, assessed, and closed as far as his direct involvement was concerned. He had received no formal public recognition, which was exactly correct. Recognition of this kind of work is,
by definition, impossible. You cannot commend someone publicly for preventing a thing without revealing that the thing existed to be prevented. The acknowledgement existed in a different form, internal, known to those who needed to know it, sufficient in the way that such things are sufficient in a world where sufficiency has to substitute for visibility. He did not feel the lack of it. He had not entered the work for recognition, and 19 years had not changed that. He had entered it because he believed in the principle of it, the idea that it is possible to build systems that protect the people inside them, that attention and training and commitment to process can create a wall between ordinary life and the things that want to disrupt it. He had spent his career building that wall, in 100 different rooms, with 100 different variables, and he believed in it the way people believe in things they have tested every day and found to hold. The morning with the glass had tested it. It had held. That was the whole story, in the terms that mattered to him. But there is another way to tell it, which is the way that the people closest to George carry it, silently, in the private interior of their knowledge of that morning. Princess Catherine had been told, and the knowledge had done to her what knowledge of near misses does to parents, which is to permanently alter the texture of ordinary moments. Every ordinary Wednesday that came after that one carried, faintly, in its background, the awareness of what a Wednesday can contain that isn't visible on its surface. She would watch her son reach for a glass at the dinner table and feel, briefly, the ghost of the version of events that hadn't happened. She would say nothing. She would let the moment pass. She would continue with the conversation about homework or dogs or whatever small thing was occupying the table that evening. But she would know. That is what these things leave behind. Not trauma, exactly, not in the clinical sense, but a permanent sharpening of awareness, a recalibration of the imagination's sense of what ordinary mornings are capable of. The people who love the people being protected live permanently in the knowledge that the protection is necessary, that it is continuously deployed, that it works until, in some other morning that cannot be foreseen, it has to work again. That is the compact. That is the bargain that comes with the position, the visibility, the weight of the institution, the history and the meaning and the public life. The protection comes with it, is built into it, is part of what the institution provides to the people living inside it. And the people living inside it accept the protection and accept, alongside it, the permanent, quiet knowledge that it exists because it has to exist. George did not have that knowledge yet. He was 9. The morning had passed over him without leaving a mark, which was precisely the outcome that everyone responsible for his safety had worked toward. One day he would be old enough to understand more fully what these systems are, what they do, what they have already done on his behalf in moments he will never know about. One day the stories, some of them, would be told to him. He would learn, in the way that people who grow up in positions of this kind eventually learn, that the ordinariness of his childhood had been an achievement, not a given. That ordinary mornings had been fought for, continuously, by people he might not even know by name. He would learn what it means to be protected. He did not know it yet. On the morning that the investigation concluded its primary phase and the relevant findings were delivered to those in a position to act on them, George was at school arguing, with considerable passion, that a particular answer on a maths test had been marked wrong when it was, in his view, not wrong but, rather right in a way that the question had failed to adequately account for. He was making this case with the kind of detailed, persistent logic that 9-year-old boys deploy when they are certain they are correct and equally certain that the adult in question has not properly appreciated the full dimension of their argument. He was very much himself. He was entirely ordinary. He was 9 years old, and he was fine, and he had been fine all along, and the reason he had been fine all along was invisible to him and always would be, which is exactly as it should be. The officer sat in a briefing room and listened to the final summary of the investigation and asked 2 questions and received 2 answers and stood and left the room and went back to work. There was a different gathering that afternoon, a different room, a different table, a different set of refreshments to assess. He walked into the room the way he always walked into rooms, with the same divided, comprehensive attention, cataloging everything simultaneously, looking at the obvious and the peripheral, the expected and the anomalous. He looked at the pictures on the table. He noted their positions, their appearance, the quality of the light moving through them. He noted the exits. He noted who was in the room and where they were standing. He took up his position near the door and became, to everyone who looked at him, a part of the room's background. The kind of presence that people register without registering, that exists without calling attention to itself, that does its work in the spaces between the things people are looking at.
The gathering began. The room was full and ordinary and entirely unremarkable. And, somewhere in the background of it, quiet and invisible and completely reliable, the machine that protected the people in it ran without interruption, the way it always ran, the way it was built to run, doing the thing it existed to do in the only way that thing can be properly done. Without anyone knowing. Without anyone needing to know. That is what protection looks like when it works. It looks like nothing. It looks like an ordinary room on an ordinary afternoon, full of ordinary people doing ordinary things. It looks like pitchers of water on a table and a man standing near a door and a child who comes home from school and eats a snack and argues about a maths test and asks for a dog. It looks like every Wednesday that ever was. It looks like a boy who is 9 years old and has no idea and is entirely, completely, beautifully fine. That is what it looks like. That is all it ever needs to look like.